Hello and welcome back to the Amoral Philosopher YouTube blog. We're here again with my friend Dima, and this is another episode on philosophy of religion. But this is a very special episode. It's unlike the ones that we have done before. It's special because in this episode, we'll address some of the comments that we received from the audience, that is you. And we are very grateful for one of our friends, Phil, who has posted his comments on Facebook. So today we'll be discussing Phil's comments, and for that I'm gonna share the screen momentarily.
Anton, while you're doing that, may I just say how grateful I am to Phil for interacting with the content that we put out, for watching all of the episodes and leaving his thoughts for our consideration. This is a real treat to interact with Phil, and so I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah. Excellent. So Phil, I'll be playing your part for this episode. So the comment is the following: sure, I can write one objection here, and it is your definition of theism. You said it is a belief in God or gods in episode 2. The problem is that you're defining it in a way you yourself do not agree with, and as I assume you're a polytheist. You're not a polytheist, sorry. Of course, you have a reason for this, but the problem is that Christians always make such definitions that are always different from what people actually believe. So Dima, what do you have to say to Phil in response to this?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Right. So I would like to just clarify something. Phil says that I said that theism is a belief in God or gods in episode 2, but that's not quite right. I said that theism is the proposition that God or gods exist. So I tried to actually distance myself from the definition of theism and atheism in terms of belief. I think it's best to define it in terms of propositions. It's not a huge substantive point, but I did want to clarify this. Right. Then, yeah, and then Phil is saying that I'm defining it in a way that I myself do not agree with, right? So the way that I understand what Phil is saying here is that the proposition, I think
Sorry, I skipped accidentally.
Yeah, right, no worries. The way that I think, what I think Phil is saying is that the proposition God or gods exist is, right, so the proposition is a something that I don't endorse because I'm not a polytheist. So he basically wants to say that maybe there's some kind of disingenuity on my part, on my part, in defining my position in a way that I don't actually agree with, right? So that's what I take him to be saying. So what I would like to do is sort of think about the following. I mean, Phil is exactly right. I'm not a polytheist. I do not believe that there are many gods. But it doesn't follow from that I don't believe that the proposition God or gods exist is true. All right, so just think about it. What is the logical form of the proposition God or gods exist? I take it to be a disjunction, which essentially says either God exists or gods exist, right? And then we could ask, under what conditions are disjunctions, any disjunction whatsoever, false? Like, what would be the conditions under which a disjunction is false? And from the point of view of logic, there's only one circumstance under which a disjunction is false, and that would be if both disjuncts are false, right? So take, for example, a disjunction either P or Q, right? The only way that that disjunction as a whole is false is in a circumstance where it is not the case that P and it is not the case that Q. But that also means that any other circumstance, right? For example, the circumstance that only one of the disjuncts is true will be a circumstance in which the whole disjunction is true. This is, logically speaking, quite airtight. So if P is true, the disjunction P or Q will also be true. Similarly for Q, and also similarly for the circumstance when both P and Q are true. So again, think about the proposition, God exists or gods exist. I am a monotheist. I think that there is a God, right? And so I have the circumstance, right, is that I think that one disjunct is true. And so it just follows necessarily that the whole disjunction is true. And I therefore am within my rights to believe the whole disjunction, precisely because I affirm one of the disjuncts.
Right, right.
Does that make sense before I sort of carry on explaining? Anton, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I'm just trying to think here on behalf of Phil and what
Yeah.
he was mostly concerned with. So I guess what Phil could say in response to that is that, yeah, it might follow from the fact that you believe in a single God, that you believe that either one God or many gods exist. So a disjunction does follow from your belief in one of the disjuncts.
Right.
But he may sort of question whether the opposite is true, whether your belief in the disjunction necessarily entails that one single God exists. In other words, perhaps Phil is concerned about what we call the gap problem in one of our introductory episodes. So it may be that what Phil has in mind is that the proof of theism, if theism is understood as a thesis that either one God or several gods exist, does not constitute by itself a proof of Christian theism or belief in a single monotheistic God.
Yeah, I would not contest that at all. Like, if that is what Phil is saying here, then we don't disagree. I don't think it follows from affirming a disjunction that you therefore know the circumstance under which it's true necessarily, right? That it follows that therefore one disjunct is true. It doesn't follow. So I don't think we would disagree on that understanding of the question. Maybe I could just briefly comment at this point on the sort of my motivation for defining it the way I did.
Yeah.
What I wanted to do in the introductory episodes for our series is to be as not to be as ethnocentric as the tendency is in the West in defining issues. So I wanted to honor the usage according to which polytheism, panentheism, pantheism, monotheism all share something in common, namely theism, right? Where theism is an umbrella term that covers a number of positions. And so monotheism would be a variant of theism, but so would polytheism, and so would pantheism, and so on. So I just wanted to honor common usage. So perhaps here I could just clarify where I got the definition. I didn't invent it. I borrowed it actually from the atheist philosopher Graham Oppy in his Introduction to Atheism, where he defines theism in this way. And I was, of course, also aware of the broader use to honor the similarities and the feature that various forms of theism have in common. So that was my motivation.
Right.
Yeah.
So with that, should we maybe move on to the second part of Phil's first comment here?
Yeah, sounds good. I hope, Phil, I haven't misrepresented you. Please come back if at any point I did or Anton did. Please let us know.
Right. So let me read just the second half of Phil's comment here. So he says the following: another specific example would be the resurrection of Jesus. Theologians parse the text and basically discard huge amounts of the Gospels as unknowable or unprovable, and then argue on the basis of what is known from applied historical methods. This leaves a bare few facts left as proof that Jesus probably arose from the dead. An analogy to this would be like throwing darts at a dartboard. A few hit the right spot, and these are the arguments that apologists use, but all the darts that missed and ignored are ignored without really asking why they missed.
Right.
So what do we make of this comment?
Yeah. So I will, so Phil starts by saying another specific example, right? So the earlier example, I take it, would be my use of the definition. I hope that I have clarified that, but would be the resurrection of Jesus. So a couple of thoughts. First is, in our series, we weren't planning to cover the historical argument for the resurrection of Jesus, right? And the reason for that is that we're mainly focusing on philosophy of religion. There's just too many areas otherwise for us to sort of try to keep track of. And we wanted to just focus on the philosophy side of things. So there's that. But let me just briefly say a few things about this part. I think what Phil might be referring to is a particular strategy that apologists use in arguing for the resurrection of Jesus and arguing for the proposition that Jesus probably rose from the dead, which is known or called a minimal facts approach. Okay, so what that is about is basically, in one's case for the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus, one is only allowing oneself to appeal to facts that are believed to be true with respect to the historical Jesus, right? So appeal to only those bodies, appeal to only that body of facts that the vast majority of New Testament scholars, regardless of whether they're Christian or not, would think is historical, right? And so you would mount your case given those minimal facts that are agreed upon widely by people working in the field. So I think that's what Phil is pointing to, right? And what he says here is that essentially he might be suggesting that there is something dishonest in the use of historical methods in one case, right? So you are applying historical methods that are accepted by sort of standard historiography or that are accepted by just secular historians, right? And apply it to the case of surrounding the historical Jesus, right? And then get to some minimal set of facts and then argue from them to the resurrection of Jesus, while not recognizing that the same use of the historical criteria would expose as probably unhistorical large portions of the text, let's say in the Gospels, right? And so in a way, there is a positive and a negative use of historical methodology, and the apologists are guilty of only using one positive use, where you show that something is probable, while not continuing to use the same methodology to show that, well, the vast majority of other facts in the Gospels should be judged as Phil puts it, unknowable, unprovable. So that's what I think Phil is trying to say. What do you think, before I respond to this interpretation of mine of what Phil is getting at here?
Yeah, I had the same impression that what Phil must be concerned with is some kind of a cherry picking on the sides of the religious apologists when they essentially to address the gap problem, perhaps if they're satisfied with the proof of theism in some sense, and then to go to the acceptance of some tenets of the Christian religion, you have to rely on some texts, and those would be the Gospels or other scriptures. And the thought that Phil has is that there's so many of them, and they might contradict each other, and they have different translations and interpretations. And it seems like what the religious apologists are doing is they're picking specific parts that sort of fit their explanation and try to use those, or ignore the rest, which is not in line with their thinking. And in this connection, an example that comes to my mind is from one of the Guy Ritchie's film, the Snatch, I think it was called, from 2000. It starts with this scene when several men dressed as Orthodox Jews are going to rob a bank, and they're having a conversation between each other. And one of them is saying, well, look, the whole Catholic Church is based on misinterpretation. And how the other questions, how so? Well, they just took the Hebrew text and they translated the word, which meant in Hebrew a young woman, and into a virgin. And it was an easy mistake. It was very close in spelling. And you use that fact, you let it brew for a couple of 100 years, and there you have the Catholic Church. So right, so maybe Phil is referring to some anecdotes like that, or to some mistakes, or maybe to conscious attempts by the apologists to sort of cherry pick whatever fits their story.
So yeah, that's good. That's good. So obviously, I'm not going to speak for all apologists. I am not necessarily a fan of every apologist. Not at all. I frequently critique a lot that goes under the rubric of Christian apologetics today. There is a lot that I think is not right. It's poor scholarship. It's indeed cherry picking. It really needs to be more charitable, not just direct strawman and knock it down, but to steelman the views that you critique and so on. So there is that, but I think Phil wants to make a bigger point than saying that some apologists are guilty of cherry picking. He thinks that, it seems to me, that the whole methodology of using historical methods to show that certain number of facts surrounding the historical Jesus is probable, or probably happened, is historical, while not seeing that the same higher biblical criticism or the same methodology would lend you to skepticism with respect to a lot of other verses, a lot of other descriptions of events surrounding the historical Jesus, right? So here's what I would want to say. The first thing I want to say is that first of all, if the person wants to argue that Jesus probably rose from the dead, what is the alternative than arguing from facts that are widely believed to be historical, right? What would be a better methodology to use? And I think Phil would agree that it would be useless to appeal to only facts that one believes on the basis of treating scripture as inerrant and inspired. I think if only the person who is a Christian and thinks that this portion is inspired, is without error, could accept the argument on the basis of that portion of scripture, right? Then I think it's a useless argument for the purpose of persuasion, right? So in other words, I do think it makes sense that you would want to appeal to facts that are widely accepted, not just by Christians. So let me give you just a number of those facts, right? For example, that Jesus existed, that he was known to be, or people thought of him as a miracle worker of some sort, that he had disciples, that he died under Pontius Pilate by crucifixion, that Joseph of Arimathea, a member of Sanhedrin, gave him an honorable burial, that disciples of Jesus experienced what they later described as, had an experience of some sort, right? That they later described as appearances of Jesus alive, right? They described it as him being resurrected. So those are the kinds of facts that guys that use minimal facts approach in their apologetic would appeal to. And it is true, and I don't think Phil necessarily would contest that these are facts that the vast majority of historians in the field can agree upon. So I guess then the relevant question is more like this. Are they sufficient, right? So the facts, the number of them and what they are, right? Are they sufficient as a whole to do what the apologist wants them to do? Make the probability of the resurrection of Christ high enough, right? And so that's, I think, the relevant question. Not in principle, the use of well-attested historical facts. That seems to me the only right way to go, is to, if you want to be persuasive, if your purpose is not preaching to the choir, you want to use facts that have evidence for them of the quality that is convincing not only for Christian people. Okay, so that's kind of one thing that I want to say. But another thing that I want to say is that it's on the use of historical methodology, historical methods, the application of them. So I mentioned the positive and the negative use, right? So let me give you an example of the kind of historical criteria that are used across the board and apply to the ancient texts to doing history. So one would be, for example, multiple attestation, right? So if you have an event that is attested in multiple independent sources, and you have good reason to think that they're independent, right? You have just gotten a probabilistic boost for that event, right? Because there is multiple witnesses essentially that attest to a particular event, and the likelihood that an event would be invented, and two independent people would just or more would just sort of would describe it, would mention it, would talk about it coherently. The likelihood is so low that the presence of multiple attestation is thought by historians to be probabilistically significant. It raises the probability of whatever event we're talking about, right? So that, I think, is not under dispute, and I don't think Phil would disagree with that. Similarly, I don't think Phil in principle would disagree with, for example, the probabilistic boost that a particular event in recorded history gets from something called the criterion of embarrassment. Okay, so let me give you an example. It seems unlikely that if you wanted to invent a religion and get followers for it, that you would want to invent precisely the things and features to your religion that will make it harder for people to embrace it, or would be judged as embarrassing in that culture. Again, if your purpose is persuasion, it just seems unlikely that people would want to make their job harder. So what would be a relevant example in the case of the historicity of events surrounding Jesus' life and death? For example, we have a record in the Gospels that there's multiple attestation to the fact that women followers found the tomb to be empty after the crucifixion, right? And right, so I guess the relevant question there is, given that the culture of the time really looked down upon women testimony, we have multiple references in other works of antiquity where women are put down for the value of their testimony in court, right? So would you want to invent a story where it would be women, the very strata of society that would be looked down upon as reliable to be witnesses, to be the first evangelists to carry that message, right? And the likelihood seemed to be that you don't want to complicate things for yourself. So that does mean that it's more likely, as a result of that embarrassing feature, right, that it was so that the tomb was found empty, that the empty tomb tradition has some credibility from a historical point, right? But here's what I want to say. So let's just take those two criteria and ask, well, what about reversing that? Does that also give you an automatic disconfirmation? In other words, let's say the absence of embarrassing feature makes it automatically unlikely that a particular event happened, or the absence of multiple attestation to the event, does that make that event unlikely? And I want to say not necessarily. In other words, I would argue that the criteria that are often used and appealed to make something probable historically are not automatically disconfirmatory of a particular event if they're absent. Like, it depends on other features of the event in question and how it's described. In other words, if you just have one record about an event, like one source historically for some event, right? It doesn't automatically mean that because you don't have multiple witnesses that the event probably didn't happen, right? It doesn't work this way. It would depend on, for example, whether you have good reason to expect there to be multiple attestation to an event, and you, as a historian, have good reason to think that you would find such multiple attestation worry there, right? Only then are you warranted to use it in a negative way, use the same criteria in a negative way, and automatically assign a low probability for an occurrence of some event because it doesn't have multiple attestation. What do you think about this point? I do think that this is not hugely contested, actually. At least the examples I'm giving, that many things we take on the testimony of one source, for example, in history.
Right.
It depends on other features of the case. It doesn't automatically make it improbable. But the presence of certain things does make it automatically more probable, in the sense that multiple attestation that is independent just immediately raises the probability. Similarly for embarrassing features.
Yes, I guess perhaps what Phil had in mind with his comment is that there can be some evidence for Jesus' rising from the dead, and there can be some evidence for an alternative explanation of the events that happened to Jesus. And he was concerned that maybe what the apologists do is that they ignore certain other explanations and they don't take that evidence into account. So they just sort of cherry pick those facts that fall within their explanation. So maybe that was his concern. But again, I don't know if we can address that in our video here today.
Yeah,
but
it might take us too far afield. Just a very brief thought is that in my experience, at least, of looking into sort of historical apologetics, I don't see sort of apologists not discussing alternative explanations. For example, the hallucination hypothesis, the swoon theory, that Jesus didn't really die, that there was a twin who was crucified in his place. I think, honestly, I haven't seen that, but maybe Phil will come back and clarify that for us.
Yeah. So should we move on to his next comment then?
So sorry, just one last point I just wanted to make. Let's say worst case scenario for what is sort of maximally, right, that this objection can do. I think what it can do is basically, suppose that the apologist must, in all consistency, view many other texts as unknowable, right? Suppose that's the case. And what would be the further sort of step? The worst possible step, it seems to me, would be something like, well, I should rethink what I believe as a Christian about biblical inspiration. In particular, I should reject the evangelical understanding of biblical inerrancy, according to which human authors of Scripture never erred in the account of events that they've given, right? That Scripture contains mistakes. I don't even think it would lead you to reject biblical inspiration. For example, I myself do not subscribe to evangelical understanding of biblical inerrancy. I don't think that it's incompatible with divine inspiration that human authors of Scripture erred in what they said. The relevant question for me would be, as far as divine communication is concerned, is what God intended to communicate as true? And that's what I want to preserve. So then it becomes a matter of interpretation of how God appropriated a particular human discourse in his communication to the church, say. And it's quite compatible with error in Scripture and human authors intending to communicate something else. So I'm sure Phil knows what I'm talking about. That at most, I believe this objection leads to rethinking of a particular view on divine inspiration of Scripture. Right. Yeah.
Right. Okay, so let's carry on then and take a look at Phil's second comments.
Yeah.
Where he says the following: I have listened up to 50 minutes of episode 4. Thank you, Phil, by the way. My thoughts are this. I define evidence very differently from you. I would add to your definition of evidence the requirement that evidence has to be tangible in some way. So a property that is observable and measurable through seeing it physically, or its effects on other physical objects. Obviously, this is far narrower than your definition.
Yeah.
So again, here I understand that Phil was not happy with
My
how
definition.
you define evidence when we were
Yeah.
talking about that.
So yeah. So I defined evidence as anything that increases the probability. So evidence for a hypothesis H is anything that increases the probability that the hypothesis H is true. And I take it that what Phil is saying, that that's too broad, that something extra is needed for it to be counted as evidence. And so I guess just on the surface, I just have to be honest, I don't quite see how it would work. But so two possibilities. So one possibility is we go ahead with Phil, right? And we introduce an extra condition on something's being counted as evidence beyond its being it increasing the probability that some hypothesis is true, right? If that's the case, and if I'm interested in the truth of some hypothesis, in the truth of some proposition, right, and I am aware that there is some consideration, right, that increases the probability that the hypothesis is true, but may not meet the further condition that Phil proposes for us to add, right? I think it would, if I'm interested in truth, and probability is related to truth in that it makes the probability that something is true higher, right? Then in that case, of course, it would be, even if it's not going to be cold evidence, let's call it evidence or something like that, I think it's still relevant for rational assent, whether there are considerations that increase the probability that some proposition is true. So that's kind of one thing I wanted to say, that that I think it would still be relevant even if we don't call it evidence and we just have a different use of words at this point. But even if, but on the other hand, I think that so when I think about the proposition that when I think about my definition, right, that which by the way is quite standard, that evidence is anything that increases the probability of a hypothesis that it's true. In a way, what should we call it if not evidence? So that's kind of my other point. Like, what is it if it actually increases the probability that something is true? So those would be my first 2 points before I consider the actual extra condition that Phil is suggesting. Any thoughts on this, Anton?
Yeah, I was also wondering if Phil was suggesting that we should introduce further conditions on what we consider as evidence, and
Right.
his condition was that it should be observable, measurable through seeing it physically, then it seems that a lot of things that we typically count as evidence would not fall within that definition. So for instance, things like testimony, right?
Yeah.
Testimony, well, it's not, if someone testifies about something, that something is not observable and measurable right now at the time of the testimony. And it's hard to say whether the testimony itself is measurable or seen physically. It's basically a piece of information that is transmitted, but we take that as evidence nonetheless. And so perhaps if we were operating on this overly restrictive understanding of what evidence is, such understanding would not be in line with what we typically understand as evidence. There would be a drawback for that view.
These are my thoughts as well. I was going to bring it up, but thank you, Anton. Yes, I think that it might be too restrictive of what we normally would want to count as evidence. That's right. But also I want to say, maybe this is where I might have misunderstood Phil. Please, Phil, clarify for us. When, for example, when we will appeal in the Kalam cosmological argument to the beginning of the universe, right? To cosmology, or when Christians appeal to I don't know, the fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life and so on. these are things that astrophysicists study. These are things that are open for empirical investigation. In other words, they could satisfy, it seems, the further requirement that it be something tangible. Like we're looking at certain effects, and we're considering facts that are in principle open to empirical investigation. So what exactly is the problem? It seems to me that maybe where this would be a problem would be, for example, for the moral argument. But even there will be certain things appealed to that have to do with physical beings, their suffering, facts about suffering, and that is quite accessible and tangible. So that's kind of another question maybe that I have is, why would it make the arguments that are typically presented in the cumulative case from phenomena to an explanation of some phenomena in terms of causation, from the effect to the cause? Usually the effect is something that's observable. So then what would be exactly Phil's problem with that? Why would that immediately make it speculative in principle? So that, I guess, would be my clarifying question at this point. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. But I see that Phil's comments also had a second.
Oh yeah, we must continue. Absolutely.
Should we take a look at that?
Yeah, so let's do that.
So Phil continues, I would say your definition also, that is definition of evidence, also allows for what I would call speculation because of the plausibility of alternative explanations and no method to distinguish between them. There is no method to choose one explanation over the other, I understand. Without this narrower definition, you can just simply multiply explanations or make up something based on only speculation. Whatever result you come to in your reasoning, I could just invent or find any religion that would match your end conclusion, but would still be wrong. Or I could just say it was an alien race that created everything and gave us religion. Having this narrower definition of evidence is necessary to exclude these other wrong conclusions. Right. So if I may, just to summarize,
please go ahead. Yeah.
The way I understand it is that Phil believes that if we operating on this broad definition of what constitutes evidence, that somehow prevents us from choosing between alternative explanations for the phenomenon we're trying to explain. And if we were operating on a narrower definition of evidence, that would supposedly help us narrow down and choose what is the most plausible explanation amongst the ones that we have on offer.
Yeah. So that's how I was reading it as well. But to be honest, I don't quite see. So, okay. So here's how I think about it. So we need to distinguish particular propositions that represent hypotheses, right? Explanations for some phenomena, and then the data, the evidence for to be considered and before us, right? For which we would then seek to explain it, right? And appeal to certain hypotheses as better or worse in terms of explaining this data. So if we keep those domains separate, evidence for H and H, then I guess what I don't see is the relevance of the content of one's evidence for the possibility of multiplying and coming up with all sorts of explanations. So for example, it's known that you can have an infinity of explanations for any phenomena that is observable, that satisfies this further condition even, right? It's empirically accessible. The fact that it's empirically accessible cannot sort of by itself prevent one from what Phil calls speculation as far as what could explain it. So I just don't quite see the move from the content of a particular piece of evidence, that it be about physical entities, to it therefore restricts which hypothesis we could bring to the table in order to explain it. What I think Phil wants to say is we need a criteria that would limit what kind of explanations we might put on the table. Now, that's a different concern, I would say, than the concern with the definition of evidence or the concern of sort of what the precise how the precise content of some piece of data might affect the possibility of multiplying
Yeah.
explanations. I think that scientists would be quite happy to say there are infinities, in fact, of possible, potentially an infinite number of theories that could be brought forward to explain some phenomena. And then you do have, in fact, I believe, criteria by which you can adjudicate that one is better or worse. We mentioned that in our episode, was it episode 3, I believe, where we talked about the criteria of simplicity. If an explanation multiplies entities beyond what's necessary to explain the data, well, too bad for that explanation. It should not be treated very seriously, right? If a particular explanation is ad hoc, well, too bad for that explanation. If it explains facts well, great. If it doesn't, too bad for it. In other words, there are criteria that are used in abductive reasoning, thinking what best explains a given phenomena. And I think we can adjudicate theories. We can do a proper theory choice using these criteria without attempting to restrict the very possibility of putting on the table some hypothesis. It's just that you can quickly deal with hypotheses that will not do a good job of explaining for various reasons, right? At the level of comparing them to others. So I guess that would be my main point. And if I may, just another one, just to address the last couple of sentences. So this is a perfect example. So for example, the possibility that an alien race created everything and gave us religion. So we can ask, how well does this explanation in fact explain the data we're trying to explain? So in just a moment, we're going to be talking about the Kalam cosmological argument, for example, which talks about the absolute beginning of the universe, that all space and time, energy and matter began to exist a finite time ago, right? Suppose that's true. Suppose you grant that that's the relevant fact to be explained. So how well would I take it to be, alien race that exists in the universe, that is itself part of the universe and therefore part of something that had a finite beginning, right? The universe is older than it, I presume. How would a part of the universe be a good explanation for the fact that the universe as a whole had a beginning? We would say it's irrelevant as an explanation, period. So that's just an example of sort of looking at whether a particular hypothesis actually does any explaining. If it does, there are other criteria that we could use to compare it to some other explanation, and on that basis, make the theory choice that we want to make. What do you think, Anton? I hope I'm not being in any way uncharitable here, that I'm getting what Phil is saying.
Yeah, I think that might be what Phil was getting at anyways. One way to interpret what he suggested is that to say that in addition to introducing some requirements and criteria for what kind of evidence we going to accept, we also need some kind of criteria that we're going to apply to alternative hypotheses for explanation of this evidence. And the question can be whether these criteria are satisfied by the theory that is preferred by religious apologists.
That's right. And I would want to say, by the way, that I think honestly, this isn't just having to do with religious apologetics. I think this issue, it can be equally raised to any inference of the best explanation strategy for anything. So yeah, I let me see if there was, I think there was something else I wanted to mention. No, I think that's sufficient. I think we could move on. That's
all right.
good.
Well, we can always come back to this, but let's move on, because I think Phil had a couple more questions or comments that he put. So yeah, let me read this one. So Phil is saying, my second point is your use of probabilities. Because your definition of evidence is too broad, you're using probabilities in different ways without distinguishing between what I have called speculation and what is tangible evidence. For example, evidence is only cumulative when it is tangible, because you can add it together, as you used in the court case example. But if you're speculating and you don't have tangible evidence, you have to multiply your probabilities together.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Right. So there are a couple of things that I would want to say about this. First, again, so Phil uses the court case example, which is a little bit maybe at odds with the hardcore insistence on tangibleness of evidence, as you mentioned, given how important testimony is in court. But here's, I guess, a more pertinent point. Phil, it seems to me, is trying to say something like this. If you're dealing with what he calls speculative evidence, then you have to ultimately multiply your probabilities together. And so what could he mean by that? I think he might be referring to the use of the law of total probability in probability theory. So let me illustrate where that straightforwardly everybody agrees applies. So, for example, so you have 5 tosses of coin, of a particular coin, right? And each toss, we just make sure is probabilistically independent from any other. So they're separate 3 tosses of, separate 5 tosses of coin. And we can ask, what is the probability that all of them will land on heads, for example, right? And in other words, what is the probability of the conjunction of all 5 events, right? And then the straightforward way that we should go about answering the question would be this. We have the probability of 0.5, assuming some kind of indeterminism and fairness of coin. And that we have for all 5 different tossing events. And the way that you would want to calculate the probability of the conjunction of all of those would be by multiplying 0.5 by 0.5 by 0.5 and so on. And that you do for each event. And what you then get is the phenomena that is sometimes called the dwindling probabilities problem. That the probability for the conjunction will begin to dwindle the more independent events for the probability less than 1 you are multiplying. That's just mathematics. And what Phil wants to say, I think, is that at the end of the day, cumulative case for God's existence is going to rely on a number of different lines of reasoning, right? And somehow Phil wants to say that because it's speculation in some way, you must apply the theorem or the law of total probability to that, and essentially not just apply the calculation for the proposition or the hypothesis that all of these pieces are supposed to boost probabilistically, right, in a cumulative fashion, but to find the probability of that, of all of those, right, together after the multiplying that we do, that as you see the probability really, really low, the total probability for the hypothesis in question, that's somehow weighty and illuminating. Not only we should apply it, but once we apply the theorem of total probability, we should also find the result illuminating somehow, that we should therefore be guided by the low probability that you get at the end when it comes to the total probability of some hypothesis once you treat each evidential piece as, as separate, almost probabilistically separate event that requires multiplying, almost treat it as if it's all a conjunction of all of those things. So that's what I understood Phil to be saying, which also explains just the next portion where Phil talks about the end probability would then drop close to 0 for all the parts of the argument together. So I think Phil is talking about this problem of dwindling probabilities. And what I think Phil is recognizing quite rightly is that if you begin applying theorem of total probability globally to any cumulative case for anything, you end up with seriously unreasonable skepticism. So just think of applying such theorem to the court case. Then we would have the absurdity on our hands that the more witnesses we have, as long as the witness increases the probability of the, whatever event occurring, whatever propositions being true, by less than 1. It could be 0.99, because there are many of them, the probability will dwindle, and the probability will be, with each new piece of evidence that's confirmatory, will be less and less, which seems very counterintuitive. And I think Phil recognizes that it would be. And then he wants to somehow restrict the domain of where to apply the theory only to speculative pieces. And so what I want to say about that is two things. We will link in our description an article where probability theorist Dr. Timothy McGrew discusses the problem of dwindling probabilities and shows where the error lies in applying it to Bayesian updating, for example. As more and more pieces of evidence come in, you keep on updating your priors, right, with each new piece. Where the problem lies technically. We will not bore our audience by trying to represent that, the content of the article here, but Phil can find that in the description. Briefly, I can simply say, there is no reason why updating your priors or your probability for the truth of some hypothesis need to be thought of as a synchronic event. In other words, it could be thought of as a diachronic occurrence. In other words, there is a process. So you take one piece of evidence for some hypothesis and you update your priors. Then when you consider the next piece of evidence at a later time, you already use new priors, updated priors, having seen the first piece of evidence. In other words, at each time, you're only considering one piece of evidence, which then begins to be fed into your Bayesian analysis and your updating. And through that process, much of the problem could be technically resolved. So cumulative case for God's existence could proceed diachronically. There's no problem there. In fact, the most famous proponent, Richard Swinburne, does exactly that. His suggestion is to approach it diachronically, not synchronically. But there is maybe another bigger problem here, and that would be this. It seems to me that if Phil grants me that the so-called speculations are actually probabilistically significant for some proposition, which is our hypothesis, right? That they do increase the probability that some hypothesis is true. It's just that they're not tangible or in some other sense physically measurable. Then I think here is my response. It seems to me that the precise content of what a supporting proposition is about, right, will not matter, because ultimately application of our theorem of total probability is a structural thing. In other words, for any P, R, Q, or whatever other proposition, regardless what it's about, if it raises the probability of some hypothesis, right, then you would want to start dealing with probabilities and calculating the total probability. In other words, it would be like restricting modus ponens, which is a structural formal thing, to only propositions about tangible evidence. So, for example, if it would be like saying, the first premise, if P then Q, P therefore Q, but only if P and Q are about something specific. We recognize that modus ponens is a structural thing. It's a syntactic relation. It's not, it does not take into account the precise, let's say, inner qualities, right, of that proposition, or the precise content of what it's about, which is why it's so useful as well. And similarly for probabilities, at the level of applying total theory, total theorem of probability, or the theorem of total probability, you should not look inside the proposition. You just look at what the probability of that proposition, right, and the relevant relation that that proposition has in some other proposition. What it's about in terms of is it about some physical thing or not physical, or something not physical, doesn't seem to be at all relevant, because it's essentially also a structural formal matter, whether you apply the theorem or not. So that's what I guess I would want to say in response.
Yeah, thank you, Dima, for this. I'm just getting conscious of time here. I'm wondering
My
if
goodness. Yeah.
if Phil had any other questions, or have we covered it all with this?
I think we have.
We must have, right?
He just he just said that it's hard to articulate clearly in a short space.
Yeah,
I totally. I hope that nobody would sort of. We are dissecting and analyzing as philosophers, Phil's comment, but I think he did a great service to us all to raise these issues and for us to have this chance of discussing them and learning from each other. So Phil, please, if there's any further questions, delight us and submit them.
yeah,
And we will
and yeah, as a comment on my side, I would just encourage our other audience, our other viewers or listeners to submit their questions, and you can do it in either way that you prefer. You can go to the Amoral Philosopher on YouTube and post comments to these or other videos that you see, or you can go to the Facebook page. There is a Facebook page for Thinketeria. There is an address that you see on the screen right now. So you can like the page or post your comments or questions there. And this is another page on Facebook where we share the videos from the blog. So we'll make sure to address your questions just in the same way as we addressed Phil's questions today. So thank you again, Phil.
Thank you.
Perhaps next time when we do an episode responding to the audience's questions, we'll pick one of your own comments or questions. So stay tuned. And remains for me to thank Dima for taking the time to answer to the comments. And I look forward to seeing you all today. Well, today for another episode, because we'll be recording another episode.
Oh yeah.
I don't know if you'll be watching it today, but I look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you all. Thank you very much. Bye.